Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dager, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Dr. Keith Sawyer, one of the country's leading scientific experts on creativity. Dr. Sawyer is the Morgan Distinguished Professor in Educational Innovations at the University of North Carolina. He has published 14 books, most notably, or at least to me, is his book Group Genius, that showed us to be more creative in collaborative group settings, how to change organizations for the better, and how to tap into our reserves of creativity. He followed that book up with Zig Zag, which identifies the 8 stages of the creative process and contains over 100 techniques to enhance your personal creativity. Dr. Sawyer, I'm honored that you could join me today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I've enjoyed your work tremendously. Zig Zag grabs the idea of creativity as a way of life. I think we talk about not being a big insight, but rather a collection of small ideas. And it's the idea of bringing them together is my synopsis of the book. But I'm going to ask you a question right at the very beginning. Why do we all struggle with turning that creativity on and off, or should we be?
Part of it is just the misconceptions that hold us back. Creativity is not mysterious. Creativity, as you say, it's a way of life. It's a process. Some of these beliefs about creativity actually do interfere, like the belief that creativity comes from a big flash of insight. So then if you are waiting for the big flash of insight, then, really it's not going to come because it's mythical. Creativity is based in these very small moments of thought, small ideas that come every day. And there are a set of habits, a set of practices that we can engage in that make it more likely that we'll have these ideas. Part of what holds us back is the focus, narrow focus on one thing instead of being open to potential connections and ideas around you. But we all have that potential within us. It's just a matter of finding out how to realize it.
Well, maybe we can't turn creativity on and off, but there's moments that we have more of it.
I like to call it a deliberate process. People who are exceptionally creative are consistently creative because they do engage in these habits and practices, these ways of thought. So it's not rare in a life that is engaged creatively. So I wouldn't say so much that you're turning it on or off, because this particular way of going through the day, it's really on all the time. And that's the goal, right? That's the goal for us, is to engage in a process of deliberate creativity where you really don't know when it's going to happen, but you begin to trust the process and you know that it will happen. When you engage in this creative process, you're consistent and you're deliberate. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's off during the workday and it's on the weekend. If you're really engaging in that creative process, it happens. It's a way of life. It's all the time.
I'm dying to ask you this question, okay? And I just, it probably fit in later in the podcast better, but I just got to ask it now. Is that, we think of this idea of bringing this big group of people together, having this brainstorming session, okay, putting all the Post-it notes on the wall, and we get this aha moment. Tell me how you view this process, maybe from a problem-solving aspect, and then another from maybe a breakthrough idea process.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm a big advocate of groups. Most of my research has been on group creativity and specifically improvisational performance. I myself am a jazz pianist playing in jazz groups. It's very much an ensemble art form. And then when I was in Chicago in graduate school, I started to study improvisational theater groups, where you have ensembles of actors on stage improvising a scene together. And what I've realized as I've continued that research into business organizations is that this model of improvisational creativity aligns very well with successful organizational teams. So think about the key characteristics of improvisation. Everybody in the group is contributing, right? They're all making offers and they're saying things and they're enacting certain characters. And then each person's action leads to a response from another one of the performers. And that response drives the scene forward. So those ideas build on each other over time and drive the process in a way that one person couldn't do it alone. It becomes fundamentally an ensemble art form. So think about how you would apply that to organizations. A lot of teams in organizations, they don't structure their group dynamic that way. Instead, they do what I call additive collaboration, where everyone puts their ideas on the table, and then you have 4 people in the group, you got 4 piles of ideas, and you add them together. Now you've got 4 times as many ideas. But that's not the real potential of a team, a creative team. It's a multiplying collaboration, right? Where you get more than 4 times the creativity of the members of the group if you're engaging in this kind of dynamic collaborative process.
I'm not a musician, so I can't really relate to that jazz band real well. But the improv theater group, okay, I can. Are there rules underneath that? I mean, because it seems really effortless for those comedians just to improv.
It's true. There are a set of practices that make it more likely for the ensemble performance to be more successful. I guess you could call them rules. Maybe it's better to call them practices or habits or guidelines, but they're all designed based on experience over decades of what is more likely, what individual actions are more likely to result in a successful ensemble performance. So, for example, very simple things to start with, perhaps, that every time you take a turn of dialogue, that you should offer something new to the scene, rather than simply saying yes and agreeing with whatever happened before. Then you're not driving the scene forward. So the scene just pauses for a minute. So every time you do something, it should add something. It should move forward. And then the second piece of that, maybe the inverse, is that whenever you add something, it should respond to what's happened just before and build on it, so that in a sense you're always going up. If you respond to what's happened before by denying it or rejecting it or saying, no, I'm going to take the scene in this other direction, then the energy goes down. These sorts of things just are learned through experience by the Chicago improvisational community. And they're all designed for that multiplying collaboration, not just an additive collaboration. So there's 2 things that, well, there's a lot of things that tend to make it fail. One is if you're looking back and rejecting what's come before, you prevent that process from moving forward. But another one that's maybe a little more subtle, if you're looking too far in the future, that also ruins the scene, because the best performances emerge in a spontaneous and surprising way where nobody in the ensemble knows where it's going to go. So if you think you know where it's going to go and you predict and act as if the scene will go in that direction, it usually does not. And then it results in a conflict that takes all the air out of a scene. So really, you're always acting in that moment, but reacting to the other actors in a way that, even though you're in the moment, it actually builds over time to an ensemble performance.
Well, that kind of reminds me of this thinking of, structural tension, maybe I'll call it, where we got to have some tension to pull us. But if and you think of like going over a hill, but if that idea is too far out there, like over the hill, and we don't know what's on the other side, we start getting distracted and we may flounder and not build upon something, right?
It's the challenge of organizational management. In my research, I think all of my colleagues, that any time you have innovation in an organization, what I say is it emerges from the bottom up. It's in this improvisational fashion. The ideas come from individuals acting in a very distributed collective system. And you don't know where the ideas are going to bubble up, but that's where you get surprising breakthrough innovation. It never comes top down. It never comes from senior management saying, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to innovate. That pretty much always fails. That's the way innovation happens, is bottom up and emergent and improvisational. But if it's only that, then the risk is that it's chaos, right? And then it goes off in some weird direction where it's not aligned with your organizational strengths or your strategy, or it's a completely different industry sector, or maybe there are some legislative or legal guidelines that prevent that. So there always has to be some guidance, some guiding structures or processes in place that, I don't know if I want to say bottle, the emergent process, but channel it. And that's really the challenge of organizational management, is getting that balance right. And it's really hard to do. It's different in every industry sector. It's different depending on how mature the industry sector is. Do you have more top-down structures and guidance? Do you have more enabling of the bottom-up emergence? It's different for every organization. So that's where it takes some real subtlety of leadership.
Everyone tries to write this book and systemize the creative process a little bit, and some even try to make it a very linear type thing. Your book, Zig Zag, is that thinking different? Explain that thinking a little bit to me.
That's a good point. And as a matter of fact, right over here, I have a bookshelf full of creativity books, and it looks like you do in your office as well. There are a lot of books out there about innovation and creativity and how to enhance your organization. There are some misconceptions, though, and one of the biggest ones is that creativity is linear, or that the innovation process is linear. And it's built into business process management. For example, you have the so-called stage gate model or waterfall model, right? And a lot of organizations are still designing their innovation processes on these linear models. Whereas the reason I call my book Zig Zag is to emphasize that the process is not linear. It's a wandering improvisational process. So I started out studying group improvisation, and then as I got more and more involved with creativity research, I discovered that even the individual process of creativity is essentially improvisational. It's a wandering, unpredictable path that is more likely to lead to a successful creative innovation.
Yeah, but Dr. Sawyer, you give me 8 steps, but those 8 steps aren't linear, or explain them to me a little.
Yeah, I had mixed feelings about that. It is the nature of a book that it goes from start to finish. So books are linear by design, I suppose. So yes, I did have to put the chapters in an order. And I do occasionally call them steps, for lack of a better word. I prefer to call them practices or habits of mind, where they can come in any order. I do have some very awkward and confusing graphic images in the book where I have the 8 steps or practices in a circle, and I've got arrows crossing across the circle about what order they can come in. And as a matter of fact, I actually created a card deck. I have a copy of my card deck here, where the techniques that I have in the book, I have about 120 creativity enhancing techniques in Zig Zag, and I put them into these 8 practices. So here with the card deck, you can shuffle it up. You can pull them out, whatever comes up randomly. And then I think the card deck represents the wandering process better than the linearity of a book.
When I use that card deck, is that meant for, I mean, real stuff, real business, or is that just something for a workshop?
Oh, absolutely. Because each of the cards is based on creativity research. I am a psychologist. I'm a creativity researcher. So I try to only recommend advice that is aligned with creativity research. So one of the things I was trying to do with my book and my card deck, Zig Zag, was to make sure every technique was grounded in research. And this is how the mind works when it's being creative. So this works everywhere, right? I mean, you could put these cards or these techniques in a group of graphic designers who are coming up with a new advertising campaign, or you could put it in a group of computer software programmers who are trying to debug an error in their database system, or it even could be finance or accounting. It's the nature of the creative process. It's the nature of how ideas are generated. It really doesn't change depending on the industry, or whether you're in a business, or whether you're in a workshop, or whether you're at a nonprofit board of directors trying to figure out how to raise money. It's all creativity.
So with the cards, I could actually put it out there, kind of like I always used Scamper for years. Okay, that methodology was always pinned up on my bulletin board in my office. Okay, when I would sit back at my desk, I'd look at the word Scamper and see the the different nomenclature for it. But Is that kind of how the card should work? Is that, when I'm sitting there thinking, when I'm stuck, or even with a group, is to pull them out and just to get us started?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, one of the cards is Scamper. So then
Okay.
you have another 51 cards in addition to that. So I do think that Scamper set of techniques is aligned with creativity research. So that's why I was happy to put it in. So these techniques in the book, about 120, and the card deck 52, you can take the cards with you, shuffle them, draw a card out at random if you're stuck somewhere. And my goal is that this card, you can look at it and engage in whatever exercise or activity is on that card. And because it's random, you've just drawn it out. My hope is that it'll surprise you and really spark you or prompt you to get past your problem. In a group setting, I have several games or activities that I suggest for groups. For example, putting them out on a table, or giving each member of the group 3 cards and having them lay out the card when they think it's a good point in the discussion to engage in that activity. So yes, you can engage in these techniques with the group or alone. Absolutely.
Should I be practicing the idea of creativity? I mean, like once a day, 3 times a week? Is it a muscle? Will I get better if I practice it?
I think so. Absolutely. I guess I would say creativity is a set of behaviors that anyone can engage in, and those behaviors are grounded in everyday brain processes that we use every day. It's not a separate part of the brain that is associated with creativity or having ideas. It's really a whole brain prefrontal cortex activity, and those same brain regions are involved in all sorts of activities that are problem solving, that we wouldn't necessarily associate with creativity. So we do all have that potential, and sure, I guess you could think of it as a muscle. It's learning, right? Learning modifies what's going on in the brain and makes you better at doing whatever you're learning how to do. And I think creativity is the same way. It's a set of behaviors and practices, just like, let's say, I don't know, playing tennis or piano or learning a foreign language. It's hard to do at first. The more you practice it, the more natural it becomes.
Most of all these creative processes and the things I read about, talks about drawing it out, writing it on paper, okay, these group sessions. But I live in a virtual world, okay? Will that going to hurt my creativity? Can I be just as creative?
Well, I'd say that's one key finding of creativity research is that it helps drive the process forward if you externalize your developing thought process. You put it out in some visible form, and what it then enables is it enables you to reflect on the ideas that came out of your own mind, and then to have a dialogue with them. It's hard to have the same effective dialogue if everything stays in your mind. So having that external representational form gives you that opportunity to interact with it, almost like having a conversation. But as long as it's visible or manifest, perhaps even in 3 dimensions, you could do it on a computer screen, especially if you have a Microsoft Windows 10. You can do it with your finger. You can do it with a pad of paper. A lot of creators still prefer to use a notepad. If you do it 3-dimensionally, perhaps, you could use a clay or marshmallows. But absolutely, you can do it on a computer screen. It works just as well. The key is to make sure it's separate from you, that you're externalizing. And I should say a second key is you're not generating something external as the goal of your process or as the endpoint, but you're externalizing your process all the way through, way before you know where it's going to end up. So then the dialogue with the external representation is part of the process. It's not the endpoint of the process.
Should we create more of an atmosphere in business and push forward with the ideas of creativity, or like an idea quota? I mean, we have a sales quota to try to get more ideas. Is there ways that we can accelerate ideas in that for people?
What I first think about when I hear that question is incentives. right, and incentive systems in organizations. And there's a lot of research on how would you incentivize creativity? What sort of incentive structures would you have in place if you wanted to maximize creativity? And a lot of the first ideas people come up with actually are counterproductive. For example, if you reward people for having more ideas, or if you reward them for having good ideas, that tends to reduce creativity of individuals, and it reduces the creativity of an organization. And that's counterintuitive, right? Because in most organizations, incentive systems, if I want more of something, I should reward that something, right? So it's a complicated story of how you would design the incentives. I guess that's the key message, I would say, is that it's complex and a little subtle, because you can't simply reward, or in your sense, your suggestion of having a quota, right? It's our expectation of you, every employee, that each week you will have 10 ideas. That doesn't work.
But we should do something to bring it to the forefront, though, right?
Yeah. So what can you do if you're leading an organization to foster probably what every management consultant says about everything, but it starts with culture. And if you get the culture right, these creative processes will flow naturally. If you don't get the culture right, it really doesn't matter what else you do, because you're not going to overcome the culture. So I'd say that's where to start. And then the culture, of course, comes from the leader and the leader's style. That's the main goal of a leader. Just about anyone in management consulting will tell you, is to foster a culture and set a shared vision. So the culture that fosters innovation and creativity, again, a lot of things I'll say or other people are saying as well. There's got to be a culture of welcoming failure and of risk-taking. This is one reason that rewarding good ideas doesn't work, because this zigzagging process that I've studied involves a lot of dead ends, and involves a lot of, well, what sometimes people call failures, but I prefer to think of them as dead ends, or ideas, paths that, let's say, remain unfulfilled. And, you can't reward only the successful ideas, because the successful ideas emerge from this bottom-up process. Most of what's bubbling up either isn't an idea or it's not a good idea. For example, I've just learned about this not long ago, that some organizations actually reward people for terminating a project. In other words, for a failed project. The one that's made the most media attention is Google's Alphabet/X. I think they call it the Moonshot Unit, where they have publicized this policy of rewarding failure and terminating projects, which I think that's aligned with research.
I find Zig Zag as one of those books that I read when it came out, and then I read it again, maybe 6 months later, a year later, or whatever. It's a book that I can pick up and still find things that I didn't get the first time. Okay,
That's great. Yeah.
And also, but it's one of those types of books that you could just pick a section out of and say, I that feels comfortable in this situation, and I can use it. Okay, and what have you learned from the book, and what after it's been out several years now, what have you learned in those years?
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. Yeah, that was my goal with the book, is that, like I said, you don't treat it in a linear fashion, but that you can dive into it at any point in the process where you feel like you need more of one thing or another thing. And I do have a creativity profile assessment, if you will, that you can take at the beginning of the book, so that you can see out of these 8 habits of mind which ones are most comfortable for you and which ones are less comfortable, so that perhaps you could focus on engaging in the exercises that are associated with the practices you have more trouble with. So, for example, one of the 8 practices, I call it seeing or looking. It's a sort of mindfulness or awareness of what's going on around you. A lot of people need to work on that, because part of what makes successful people successful is this ability to focus and get a lot of work done. You tend to specialize. You tend to do really well in your one discipline or subject, right? You get an undergraduate major, then maybe in your MBA program, you have concentration in finance. So you get really good at your area of expertise. But part of a sort of unpleasant side effect is you tend not to be good at noticing other things. But that we know is associated with creativity, is making connections between your area of expertise and other random things that you encounter throughout the day, if only you will look around you and engage in practices. Like one thing I do, I travel a lot to give keynote talks or do consulting, and the airport bookstore is a great place to find magazines that you normally wouldn't read. So yeah, I'll just go buy a magazine about, I don't know, motorcycles or hot rods, which I, by the way, don't know anything about, and just thumb through it. And another thing I recommend, it's not actually one of my cards in the card deck, is go to different sorts of places. Like one of them is pawn shops. Probably most of your podcast followers have never been to a pawn shop, and I hadn't either. So I said, well, I'm doing this creativity book that came out in 2013. I'm telling people to go to pawn shops, I should go. So I found, 5 pawn shops within a 30-minute drive, and I went to all the pawn shops. And then you try to identify, what is it that makes a pawn shop a pawn shop? What do they all have in common? How are they different? So it's that sort of stretching yourself to become, I guess you could call it like a dilettante, or a very tiny expert in one different thing. Anything you can do to expose yourself to a broader variety of stimuli is going to enhance your creativity.
That's always one of the things I always discovered that worked well with customers when a sales and marketing perspective is to go, don't look in the lobby what's the magazines laying out there, but look on their desk what magazines are laying out there and read what they're reading.
Oh, that's really interesting. If you came into my office and you looked on my desk, I have to say most of what's on my desk is associated with the project I'm working on right now. Do I have the Hot Rod magazine on my desk? Well, no, I don't. I do have a variety of toys on my desk so that I can pick up, and let's see, what do I have right here? I could, well, a little toy accordion. And just a complete aside, but following my own advice, I actually been a pianist my whole life, but I started taking accordion lessons a year ago, and I was 55 at the time. So most people don't try something new like that. But what I'm even more proud of, that I'd say because it's aligned with creativity research, is I've taught myself how to repair old accordions, which is like, what the hell? What does that have to do with creativity? I sit there in the garage at my workbench. I try to find the right metric screw size. It's like a lot of these things. There's not an obvious, immediate connection to your work or to creativity, but engaging in that kind of thing will indirectly pay dividends. Doesn't matter, doesn't have to be accordion repair, but that's just an example of just find some random thing that's totally different from your day-to-day job.
Now, you have 8 different practices in the book, and I would think that someone would eventually kind of start using one more than another, one that works for them, let's say. Okay, what's your favorite one?
Do I have a favorite one? Well, I suppose like everyone else, I have, of the 8 things that I'm more naturally good at. Let's see, I'll say one that I'm not so good at is the one that I call making, that is exactly based on this research of externalizing your ideas as they're unfolding. This is second nature for artists and designers. It's part of the iterative process of design. You get sketches out there. You do thumbnail sketches. You have a sketchbook you carry around with you. But for me, as a research psychologist, that's not second nature. So I actually do have to work to remind myself to get my ideas out on paper or in the computer early on. So I guess I answered your question backwards. I told you one that I'm not so good at.
I think that's an excellent way to do it. Okay. What's upcoming for you?
I'm really excited about my current research project. I'm studying how professors teach in schools of art and schools of design. And the way I'm doing that is I'm videotaping studio classrooms where, say, a graphic design professor or a sculpture professor is teaching in an MFA program. And no one, I'm surprised, your viewers probably be surprised too, no one has studied how people teach in schools of art and schools of design. So I'm thinking, this is fascinating. If you're interested in, like I am, if you're interested in how to help people be more creative, then wouldn't that be an obvious place to go, right? People who teach painting or people who teach graphic design, presumably at least, they are helping these students learn to be more creative. I've been doing this research for about 5 years now, and I'm just starting to complete my analyses and publish the research. And it's just hot stuff. I think it's going to blow people's minds what these professors do in these studio classrooms.
Oh, I think that's could be a great read to lead to another book, right?
It's going to be a book. Yes, absolutely. I'm going through the scientific process of submitting research articles to journals and having my peers review them anonymously, so that I believe in the rigor of the scientific process. But once it's been validated by the creativity research community, absolutely, it's going to make a great book for everyone to read about the lessons of enhancing your own creativity based on what goes on in art school.
What's the best way for someone to learn more about what you're doing, keeping track of it, and maybe information about the book? Is there a particular website or anything?
If anyone's interested in creativity and innovation, I hope you'll follow my blog, my Twitter handle. My blog post is keithsawyer.wordpress.com. You can link to everything from my website, which is my own name. It's keithsawyer.com, which will keep you up to date on my keynote talks and my consulting engagements and my latest publications. My Twitter handle is Dr. Keith Sawyer, Dr. Keith Sawyer. By the time I got around to getting on Twitter, Keith Sawyer was already taken. I got my domain name back in 2004, it's keithsawyer.com. That was before, I guess, people were thinking about it. So yeah, please go to my homepage, keithsawyer.com, check out my blog, follow me on Twitter, and you'll get the latest information about what's going on in creativity and innovation.
I admire your work. I'm jealous that you get to work on the North Carolina campus. I have hardly ever been to a prettier campus. And
it is beautiful here, yeah.
This podcast will be available in the Business 901 iTunes store and the Business 901 blog site. So thanks everyone for listening.